The truth is we are where we are because people have freely chosen. These people who bemoan the de-churching of America and the rising secularization of America, which is, by the way, an enormous and dramatic trend that I talk about in the book. Well, if people attended church, it wouldn't be happening. Nobody's forcing people not to attend church. Nobody's forcing people to move from little towns to big cities, but they want to because of economic opportunity and freedom and the sense that they can be themselves more. That desire for individual autonomy is very powerful. It's just that it seems that what happens is when people get it, they also experience this great sense of anxiety and loneliness. And so it's a push and pull.
Thank you. A real pleasure to be here in this splendid location in support of a splendid institution, the Harvard Bookstore, and to talk about a splendid book, The Age of Revolutions. I like the book very much, and I particularly appreciated how it combined a highly relevant look at the present while zooming out to place the present in the context of reasonably deep history. So my first two questions are respectively on the history and on the present moment. The title and the topic kind of took me back to the late 60s when revolution was kind of in the air again. The Beatles had no fewer than 3 songs with revolution in the title, and Jefferson Airplane, and everyone was talking about revolution. Our high school decided to change its history curriculum that year. In 1969, I was 14, they threw out the standard curriculum, and it was all going to be on revolutions. So the entire year we studied the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Russian Revolution, which led me to think that revolution, at least at the time, revolution means violent regime change. Now, that's not the definition that you use. A little bit closer to the gradual nonviolent revolutions, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the green revolution, the public health revolution. There are lots of things that have been called revolutions that are not revolutionary in the sense of rapid and complete change. So your revolutions are the ones that probably would not have occurred to most people: the Dutch Revolution, the Glorious Revolution, the French Revolution, 2 industrial revolutions. You divide the British and American industrial revolutions. And I don't know if you call it the liberal revolution, but you really talk about a revolution since the end of World War II, accelerating after 1989. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about what you see as the common thread, why these revolutions as opposed to Russian or Mexican Revolution. And is there a sense in which, maybe not the French Revolution, but there's a sense in which the Dutch glorious industrial and liberal revolutions are all maybe even the same revolution, just dragged out over time? So maybe start by saying what your conception of revolution is.
Well, first, thanks so much for doing this, Steve. We were trying to find somebody who we could talk to about this book who has a similar kind of sense of history and scope. Of course, Steven Pinker, I've learned so much from his books that he seemed ideal. Plus, you always want somebody who sells more books than you do. And that tends to narrow the set. He was at the intersection of the Venn diagram. Look, I got to this because I felt like we were in a revolutionary moment. Like, if you think about how much change has been taking place in the world over the last 20 or 30 years, and how much of it is radical, disruptive, upending kind of change, which really is what revolutions are all about. And I asked myself, what were similar periods of profound structural change? Stephen, you're exactly right. Lots of people use the word revolution just to mean change, or to mean, stuff seems to be moving around, or I want things to be moving around. But fundamentally, the sense in which I use it, and the sense in which it has been used by historians and social scientists, is fundamental, deep structural changes in society that transform it in some important way. And what I found was that if you were trying to understand the modern world, you actually had to start with the Dutch, because the Dutch invent, in many ways, the modern world. They invent modern economics and politics. Before the Dutch, basically politics is all about courts and kings, and it's largely a game of this kind of internal court politics. The Dutch invent the merchant republic, and you have factions and political parties, and it's all founded on a modern economy. Before that, you had these vast agricultural estates or imperial powers that would go to Latin America, steal the gold, amass the bullion. That's how you became richer and richer. It was extraction. The Dutch begin a new model, which is innovation, technology, creating actual wealth out of nothing, as it were. There's a phrase that they use, because the Dutch, figured out a way to reclaim land and to do water management in a way where they, I think, add 30 or 40% of arable land to the Netherlands. And so they say that there's a saying in Holland, God may have created the earth, but the Dutch created the Netherlands. This sense of mixing your labor with the land and creating something new, something that Locke describes in his treatise. And that fundamentally changed politics and economics. And if you look at the chart that you and I have both used, Stephen, of average income throughout human history, this based on the work of Angus Madison, a great economic historian, it basically is a flat line for 1,750 years. And then it's a hockey stick. It just goes way up. The beginning of that hockey stick is the Dutch. The Dutch are the first country to break out of millennia of poverty, of disease, and they managed to do it because of all the things I described. They become the richest country in the world. Amsterdam becomes 4 times richer per capita than Paris, which had been previously thought of as the kind of center of Europe. And that begins, most importantly, the almost self-sustaining process of improvement in income, standards of living, conditions of life that Steven Pinker has described so eloquently. So that revolution seemed to me the most profound and the one to start with. And it has 2 characteristics that I found very interesting. You have an economic revolution, the creation of this new kind of economy, the creation of the first joint stock company in the world, the Dutch East India Company, which is the richest company in the world at the time, the creation of the first stock exchange. All of that combined with the burst of globalization produced by another set of inventions around ships and navigation, tall ships, compasses, all that, which allows the Dutch to go out into the world. And then that produces 2 corollary realities. One is an identity revolution. The Dutch now start to think of themselves as different from the Habsburg Empire they were part of. They begin to think of themselves as Dutch. And they begin to think of themselves not as part of Christendom, but as Protestant and very separate from Catholics. And they create their own nation as a result of it. And then that identity revolution in turn spurs a political revolution with a backlash. And you get 2 parties in the Netherlands, one essentially for progress and the other saying, wait a minute, we're changing everything here. We're disrupting everything. I'm going to take you back. This is called the States Party. I'm going to take you back to when it was better. I'm going to make the Netherlands great again. And this is the pattern, which, as you rightly say, it recurs. In many ways, that pattern of economics and technology driving structural change, modernizing society, pushing it forward, producing an identity revolution. And then you see the backlash. The French Revolution is the only exception that I use because it's a different kind of revolution. It's a revolution not from the bottom up, but from the top down. It's elites who come into power and say, we're going to change this country. We're going to legislate equality, liberty, fraternity, all that. But France was in those days a very backward country, very agricultural, very little innovation taking place, either financial, technological. And so that change is imposed on a society that is unready for it and effectively rejects it. The French Revolution, we can have a separate debate, but it's basically a failure on any terms, on its own terms. A revolution begun to get rid of the French monarchy ends with Napoleon becoming the absolute dictator and crowning himself emperor. So it couldn't have succeeded because it ended up with an emperor when the purpose of it was to get rid of the monarchy.
Yeah. So totally fascinating. Let me bring it up to the present moment, since you do write about backlash and antithesis. In fact, I think backlash is progress and backlash from 1600 to the present. So the present moment, one of my themes in the two books that I wrote on integrating psychology and history is that one can be misled about the present moment and the trends that we're part of by focusing on salient events. The human mind gloms onto available images and narratives. The late Daniel Kahneman, who died just a few days ago, called it the availability bias, and that the only way to really understand the direction of history, or the trends or the reversals, is to look at actually data over time. Because you can always think of something that happened this morning and say, well, now everything is completely different. Well, yeah, but then you forget all the similar events that may have taken place 10 years ago, 15 years ago, maybe even more of them. As Franklin Pierce Adams said, the best explanation for the good old days is a bad memory. So I went to Our World in Data, and I went to a number of the data sets that I plotted in The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now, just to see what's happening to the world in the last few years since I wrote those books. And you pantomimed a graph. I'm going to pantomime a graph that I think captures, with a lot of simplification, the trends of the world over the last few decades. So imagine we'll start in the post-war period, which is the dawn of the rules-based international order, a lot of the institutions that seem to be threatened now, the long peace, that is the decline of great power, war. So if you imagine goodness as going up, and the starting point, let's say in 1946 to the present, with smoothing out some wiggles, kind of looks like it increases, things are getting better and better until about the first Obama term, around 2008, 2009. Then it, depending on the curve, it either levels off or goes down a little bit, kind of wiping out maybe between 10 and 30 years of progress, but still not taking us back to the levels of the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s. And by that, what curves am I referring to? Again, simplifying, because I'm talking about a lot of different indicators of the state of the world. Democracy, there was several waves of democratization, but that has started to retreat somewhat. War, the lowest year for war deaths per capita was about 2004, and it's gotten somewhat worse, but still not taking us back to the days of Vietnam or Iran, Iraq. Trade as a percentage of GDP, one of the prime indices of globalization. Human rights, women's rights, you see an increase, and then either a deceleration, a leveling off, or a slight recession. So my first question is, so you are, in a sense, writing, you started this book, you've been writing it for 10 years, so you kind of started it just as the transition where what was pretty impressive progress started to level off. So I guess one question is, would my pantomime characterize the historical trajectory that you're writing about when you talk about the present? The other is, how do we interpret that leveling off or decrease? And I'm going to give you three options, and you do speculate somewhat, but I want to draw you out on the possibilities. One of them is that it's cyclical, that everything is going to go back to the way it was in the 1940s, or perhaps even, or maybe the 1540s, that history is a bunch of cycles, empires rise, empires fall. I'd be prepared to argue against that for a number of reasons, but one of them is the curve is only gone down a little bit. It would be premature to say that it's going to go all the way back down to the days of great power warfare. But anyway, it is a possibility, and backlash is in the title. The second one, clearly, is that this is a plateau that maybe will kind of fluctuate around that plateau for the indefinite future. Some things might have a natural limit. So trade as a percentage of GDP. The era of increasing globalization can be seen in that increasing curve. And now it's, I think, about 60% worldwide. But clearly, it's never going to get to 100%. I mean, that would be inconceivable that the domestic market is not at all favored over global trade. So maybe 60% is a natural resting place for how much economic globalization you can expect. Then the third possibility is that this is a momentary hiatus, a blip, a temporary resting place, and that it's going to, could be expected to resume. And again, I'll mention a historical analogy, and this is relevant to your example of the failure of the French Revolution. I mean, it was a failure. On the other hand, there is no present king of France. It took them a while. It took them a couple of attempts, but they did get rid of the king eventually. And my favorite example is that the quintessential example of human moral progress has got to be the abolition of slavery, which used to be ubiquitous. Every civilization had slavery. Since 1980, chattel slavery has not been legal anywhere on the planet. That's a historic change. Likewise, extending the franchise to women, the end of Jim Crow laws and apartheid laws. It would be an exaggeration to say that they are inevitable, but there's something about them that seems to have historical momentum. And in the case of slavery in particular, Napoleon, after the French Revolution abolished slavery, Napoleon reintroduced it. So they had to abolish it a second time. But they did. They did abolish it a second time. Are we living in an era now that, as with Napoleon and the restoration of the Bourbons, its history will reassert itself and the improvement will resume? Now, of course, you don't have an answer as to whether it's going to go back down, stay the same, or go up, but how do you think about those possibilities?
Well, you're absolutely right about, the broad trajectory you described tracks with the data that I had collected. And as you know, there is one chart in the graph that shows the number of democracies, exactly as you say, a big rise and then a reasonably significant decline, but probably taking out about 20 years of progress, not more than that. So I began writing the book, working on the book precisely because I started to notice this stuff. And I started to notice that these trends were reversing, but more importantly, the intellectual consensus around them was reversing. I had written an earlier book about the rise of illiberal democracy, the degree to which liberalism and democracy were kind of separating out. And so I was looking at all this stuff and asking myself, where are we going? Why are these things upending? I'll tell you, what started it was the Tea Party. You see this extraordinary insurgency movement within the Republican Party. There was a very good book by a Yale scholar that pointed out, even though they talked economics, it was really all about culture. It was when you press them, there's a Theta Skocpol at Yale, when you press them, it was all about immigration and what we would now call the woke agenda or multiculturalism. That was what was animating it. The other thing you noticed was the United States was coming out of the great global recession of 2008 better than any country, any major economy in the world. And yet Obama's approval ratings were not changing at all. Very unusual. So there was something going on with the politics of the moment.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. You were seeing moments, and Biden is in exactly the same situation. We have come out of COVID better than any economy in the world, and yet Biden's approval ratings are literally flatlining. And so what I was realizing is that we are in a moment of a great cultural backlash to all these forward movements that we have seen, and that in a very fundamental sense, we are in the politics is now on a cultural battleground, not an economic one. And this is something that could be predicted when you think about Maslow's hierarchy. You know that in 60 or 70 years ago, human beings were struggling, particularly in the Western world, for basic economic survival, dignity, food, shelter, health, the things that Maslow talks about. And as you get higher up on them, you start expressing post-materialistic values. And you start thinking of your identity as shaped by those post-materialistic values. So it becomes, your gender, your race, your national origin, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation. All these things begin to take center stage. And all that change then produces a backlash. And so that was the dynamic that it seemed like we were witnessing. Now, you ask, obviously, the million-dollar question. That was inflation. Now we should say the billion-dollar question. Where does this go? And I've often thought that, at some level, people always think that there is a future out there and that smart people should tell us what it is. But I don't think there is one future out there that, even Steven Pinker can identify. I think there are many possible futures out there, and they depend on our actions, and they depend on the action-reaction. So I do think that you're right, that a complete reversion to the pre-Enlightenment age seems impossible. For all kinds of the amount of structural progress that has been taken place is just too great. But I do think you can end up with a much more complicated process where the backlash takes a long time and consumes societies and devours politics in ways that the French Revolution did, the Bolshevik Revolution did. Iran is going through a 35-year backlash to the modernization that took place in the 60s and 70s. North Korea is trapped in a tyranny for the last, it's had a father to son to grandson dynasty. And I know some of these are isolated examples, but my point is, you could imagine some of these forces going the wrong way. If Hitler had not been as foolish as to invade Russia and declare war on America, his two biggest strategic mistakes, would Nazi Germany be in control of a large part of Europe for decades afterwards? Perhaps. So the way I think about it is, I'm a Pinkerian, would one say, in the sense that I do believe that in the very broad sweep of history, we've absolutely made progress, and that progress is very hard to turn back. But could it be a somewhat bit of a roller coaster ride? And could there be particular periods, where it goes badly? You look at the Industrial Revolution, and there's about a 70-year period where average income does not go up in Britain. It would suck to be in England at that period, right? You want to be there when things are. So I think that you could have a lot of backlash, a lot of retrogression. So you point out the French. You're absolutely right. They've ended up okay, but from the revolution to now, France has had 5 republics, 2 empires, 1 monarchy, 1 crypto-fascist dictatorship, but they ended up all right at the end. I'm looking to see if there's some way we can smooth that ride.
Good. I'm glad you brought up ideas because, having written about progress, I'm often misunderstood as suggesting that this is some kind of dialectic, mystical process that lifts us ever upward, an idea that was popular in the 19th century. But what I have suggested is that this is a process that is driven by certain good ideas, ones that I associate with the Enlightenment. If we keep those ideas, progress can continue, simply because it consists in applying human ingenuity to solve problems involving human well-being. Neither the application of ingenuity nor the goal of improving human well-being is necessarily going to be characterized an era. There could be returns to superstition and magical thinking. People could prioritize national glory or religious scripture over human longevity or elimination of poverty. And if the ideas recede, as you note that they have been, then one would expect that many of these indexes of human well-being to flatten out or even reverse, because it's only the ideas, it's only the activities of humans working to make things better that ever make things better. They certainly don't get better by themselves.
If I can just give you 2 examples right now that I think are good ones, because they're, we don't think of this as the kind of cultural counter-revolution. But I would say in Russia and China, in both places, you are seeing essentially a kind of counter-revolution to the rise of liberalism and Enlightenment ideas. Xi Jinping looked at what was happening to China as it was opening up, as it was liberalizing over the previous 25 years. And he looked at that and he said, my God, this is completely transforming Chinese society, and it is going to leave the Communist Party in a very vulnerable position, because what you have is an increasingly individualistic, middle-class, liberal-minded, open society, and they're going to wonder, why do we have a Leninist political system? And so what he has tried to do in many ways is stop that process, reverse it. Everything from, much less emphasis on the private sector, much less emphasis on civil society and its organizations, much less emphasis on the kind of free expression. So for example, there are directives that went out on Chinese TV saying, we don't want effeminate looking and sounding men on Chinese TV. Because he was, these guys are all obsessed with this idea of gender fluidity. Putin has done very similar things, and in both cases, what they're doing is precisely an example of what you're describing. They're prioritizing different goals. They're saying, we want a reasonably strong economy, but we're happy to sacrifice some economic growth for control, for coherence, for national pride, and we are going to impose those values on the society. So, it's a good example of exactly what you're saying, that if you decide that you have a different rank ordering of some of these ideas, societies will go in a different path.
Yeah, indeed. Well, that brings me to another theme in the book, which is that despite the fact that we live longer, we're richer, we're freer, we have access to more information, to more culture, to more opportunities to enjoy. It seems to people feel they're missing something, some kind of meaning and purpose that was previously provided by religion, by patriotism, by tribalism. And a question is, I'm often mystified by the idea that with all of this progress, there is nothing to believe in, to devote your life to find meaning and purpose in, because it would seem to me that if we got rid of war, if we got rid of extreme poverty, which we were and probably are on the path to doing, if we increased human rights and freedom, if we've already doubled our lifespan, we could increase it even further. If we stop kids from dying, if we stop mothers from dying in childbirth, if we allow everyone to have the not just necessities, but a lot of the luxuries of life, I think that's pretty inspiring. And if we get rid of war, what's so funny about love, peace, and understanding? But somehow, with some exceptions, that humanistic agenda, that is, make people better off, make them happier and healthier, doesn't seem to get the blood pumping as much as a stirring anthem and conquest and a strong, charismatic leader and ancient scripture and so on. Is there a way in which we could make human flourishing, human progress kind of cool and inspiring? I facetiously suggested Enlightenment Now. Should we have rallies of young men in colored shirts salute giant posters of John Stuart Mill? Or should we have, getting back to the Dutch, should we have kind of secular preachers roll back their eyes in ecstasy and thump Spinoza's ethics on the pulpit? So short of that, there are a few examples that it's not impossible. So when the Salk vaccine was shown to be effective in the 50s, and the scourge of polio was going to be eliminated, church bells rang and factory whistles blew and strangers hugged each other on the streets. When the Berlin Wall fell, there were ecstatic celebrations. Leonard Bernstein conducted Beethoven's Ninth, is the Ode to Joy, with an international orchestra. And the Ode to Joy then became the anthem of the European Union. There was some global substitute for patriotism in the early years of the United Nations, the iconography of the flag and the beautiful modern building of the headquarters that seemed inspiring. The civil rights movement certainly got people excited and feeling flush, even with goosebumps during its triumphs. Is there some way in which we could mobilize a moral cause that we could defend on intellectual grounds, like reducing poverty, increasing lifespan, but give it the trappings, the symbolism, the iconography that amasses mass movements?
Right. Well, as you know, this is the thing I wrestle with in the conclusion of the book, and at least historically, there is something that human beings love about devoting themselves to a cause much greater than their own, and a cause that has a kind of mysticism and tradition to it. Think about this building. Think about all the great cathedrals of Europe. Think about all the great symphonies, all the great temples in the world. So much of the greatest art that has ever been built has been built in service of this idea of an awesome God whose wonder you cannot understand, but you stand in service of. Every war, as you say, has been kind of infused with this sense of nationalist pride and patriotic glory. The problem fundamentally, I think, is that the great achievement of Enlightenment liberalism is to say, you know how you have always been told what the meaning of life is? By your church, by your ruler, by the state. We're not going to do that. We're going to tell you that it's up to you to figure out what the meaning of life is. That's your personal quest. And as long as it doesn't oppress anybody else, it can be whatever you want. If for you it's yoga, great. If it's for you it's woodworking, great. If it's for you it's some... And while that sounds incredibly liberating, there is something about it that people find very unsatisfying and even anxiety-producing. Kierkegaard says anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. And great psychologist Erich Fromm, whose work I love, wrote a book called Escape from Freedom. And he talks about how that the burden of being told this is your challenge leaves a lot of people feeling, no, I'd rather consult the Bible. I'd rather consult the Quran. I'd rather go back to something familiar, rooted. And that's the part I think it's hard to figure out what liberalism does about, because it is inherent in the liberal project to say, no, that's your business. I'm not going to tell you what it should be. And, that's Jefferson's pursuit of happiness. And it turns out it's something we like the idea of, but we feel deeply unsettled by it. I think I would add to it one piece here, which is so much, it seems to me, of what people react against is, at some level, the psychological sense of the uncertainty. You don't know whether there's a God, you don't know whether there's an afterlife, you don't know whether there's, you are going to be punished or rewarded. But in the tangible sense, what you lose are custom, tradition, and community. So think about a steel town. The steel mill goes away. The data shows that for the most part, people they don't suffer economically, particularly after a few years. They find new jobs. But what the steel town represents is the collapse of your life, your community, your traditions. So maybe you had, a church that you went to where all the people who worked in the steel plant went to. Well, church attendance starts going down. There was a Rotary Club or a Kiwanis Club that was part of it. That disappears. There was a bowling league where everyone went, after work. That goes away. Well, there used to be a hardware store everyone went to. That Home Depot has taken care of that. Maybe there was a bookstore in some towns. Amazon has taken care of that. There's a movie theater you'd go to. Netflix has taken care of that. So what you're left with is you're maybe richer, maybe freer, but you're lonely. And that loneliness actually exacerbates this feeling, this desire to find something you can latch onto. And that is where populism comes in. That is where Trump's meetings are now like religious revivals. There was a very good piece in the New York Times about how it is consciously designed to evoke, a kind of evangelical prayer meeting. And so much of the rhetoric around it has that feeling of, we are going to take you back to that world where we can all be one. And of course, one of the things that has often created community in human history is separation from the other, right? And so there's always another. In Trump's 2016 campaign, he'd speak for an hour, but I can summarize for you in 4 lines what his message was. The Chinese are taking away your factories, the Mexicans are taking away your jobs, the Muslims are trying to kill you, I'll beat them all up, right? There's a community there around those 3 foreign others.
Yeah. Another way of putting this point is one that you alluded to in the final chapter, where you quoted Isaiah Berlin, who talks about the trade-offs that are inherent in any society, and that liberalism, I think, makes quite salient. It's true that the small, close-knit, socially dense communities had some things that we can easily be nostalgic for. On the other hand, if you go back to the reports of people who lived in those villages and those close-knit communities, they couldn't wait to get out, a lot of them. A lot of 19th century novels talk about, especially when the protagonist is a woman, the stultifying networks of gossip and reputation. If your sister got pregnant, the entire family is shamed and your life is ruined. If you're a young man, you had to go into your father's job in the factory. And so Bruce Springsteen writes songs about escaping in a convertible with your girlfriend and leaving the town as fast as you can. So people chafed under all of those intimate, close-knit social networks, including having your family choose your spouse, which could lead, in theory, to greater happiness. So a lot of us probably in this room have been divorced, and it's conceivable that if our parents chose our spouses, maybe they would have made wiser choices. But I don't think any of us would exchange the freedom even for the security of greater happiness, of someone making a choice for us. And likewise, Berlin talked about other inherent trade-offs, especially ones where the cost of freedom is greater inequality, because if people can exercise their talents and ambitions, some of them are more talented and ambitious than others, it's inevitable that there will be inequality. There are trade-offs with well-being. If you can do what you want, you have the freedom to screw up your lives. And so the aspiration for a perfect society is what leads to dystopian nightmares.
Well, I grew up in India, and I saw a lot of those small, close-knit communities that you're describing. And so I have exactly the reaction you're describing. When I think of community at some level, I want to reach for an oxygen mask because there's something very stultifying and oppressive and rigid about those communities. And as you say, it's not, the truth is we are where we are because people have freely chosen. These people who bemoan the de-churching of America and the rising secularization of America, which is, by the way, an enormous and dramatic trend that I talk about in the book. Well, if people attended church, it wouldn't be happening. Nobody's forcing people not to attend church. Nobody's forcing people to move from little towns to big cities, but they want to because of economic opportunity and freedom and the sense that they can be themselves more. That desire for individual autonomy is very powerful. It's just that it seems that what happens is when people get it, they also experience this great sense of anxiety and loneliness. And so it's a push and pull. And I think that, one way to think about it, like I don't want to sound, simple. I'm sort of a rootless cosmopolitan and proud of it. I enjoy the autonomy, the individualism, the freedom I have. I have found a way of constructing a community of friends and like-minded people that I love and I wouldn't trade for the world. But I do recognize that, this is a very powerful pull that people have, and you can't dismiss it. You can't say, well, this is just, this is a backward-looking phenomenon. The best thought I've had, Stephen, in sort of making people understand the value of this is to look at the people who don't have it and how hard they try to get it. The most powerful example we have staring at us in the face is Ukraine, right? Ukraine and Poland in 1990 had the same per capita GDP. Poland went west. Ukraine was not allowed to go west. It had to stay east, part of the Russian sphere of influence. Today, Poland is 4 times richer than Ukraine. Same per capita GDP in 1990, Poland is now 4 times richer. Now, it's not just wealth, but it's all the things that go along with having chosen to go west. having an open economy, having an open society, having democratic politics, having civil society. And the Ukrainians see that difference and care about it deeply enough that they're willing to die by the tens of thousands for it. They're willing to die even though they're up against an enemy that is 5 times bigger than they are by most measures. That, I think, gives you some sense. That is the heroic nature of liberalism that we sometimes take for granted.
That's fabulous, yes. Let me ask one more question. The book is largely about global trends, but naturally it pays special attention to one country for which we have a parochial local interest, namely the United States. In most places in the book where you talk about the post-war rules-based liberal order, you call it just the liberal order, the international liberal order. In one place, you fell back on the common expression American-led rules-based order, but mostly you leave out the American-led. And I've always been skeptical of the American-led part because in many ways the United States is kind of a rogue nation. We invaded Iraq without the authorization of the Security Council and over the opposition of allies like France and Germany. There's a Wikipedia page of treaties that the United States has not signed, and there's a long list of them. So we are kind of internationally not really the paragon of a rules-based international order. And domestically, a lot of the trends that have made life better for so many countries in the West, the U.S. is a bit something of a laggard. You mentioned that very recently the United States has caught up to most of the rest of our democratic wealthy peers in becoming more secular. The United States was a bit of behind that trend for many years. But also, if you look at almost any index of human well-being, violent crime, self-reported happiness, suicide, obesity, incarceration, child mortality, maternal mortality, the United States is kind of okay. I mean, we're in the top 20, but we are the world's richest country, and as you note, we're in many ways, the most technologically and scientifically advanced. So why is the United States kind of punching below its wealth in all of these measures, both internationally and domestically? Do you have opinions on the country that both you and I adopted, both of us being immigrants from the British Commonwealth?
So it's a very good point, and I think that it seems to me there are two different answers to it. Internationally, I think that the United States plays an unusual role in the world. It is the creator of this world order, without any question. Without the United States in 1945 having the disposition it had, we would not be in the world we're in. No European country would ever have created a world like this because they were all obsessed with their empires and trying to preserve their empires. And in fact, I'd go even further. If Franklin Roosevelt had not been president of the United States during World War II, I wonder whether we would have had this, because Franklin Roosevelt was the great liberal internationalist who happened to preside over the most powerful nation in the history of the world, in the greatest war in the history of the world that destroyed much of the world and allowed the victor, the United States, to almost create de novo an international system. That opportunity will never occur again. There will never be a great power that powerful at that moment in history, and it's highly unlikely that it would have those preferences that Roosevelt had, which were very broadly kind of open, liberal, Wilsonian. And so that founding act, it seems to me, is incredibly important. Without the United States, you would not have had the whole system of the UN, the Bretton Woods, all of that, because the United States also agreed to underwrite a large part of it and undergird it with its power. It was the largest funder by far of all of those agencies for the first 30 or 40 years of their existence. So that piece of it, I don't think we can discount. Then there is a dynamic that takes shape, partly because of the Cold War, but partly because America plays this role as this kind of guarantor, where the United States it almost believes, because it is the gatekeeper and guardian of that world, it doesn't have to play by those rules because it has broader responsibilities. It has to make sure that the bad guys are knocked down. And that means it has to sometimes act in ways that are, even violations of those rules. And if you can't get a consensus on that, well, so be it. And of course, as we know, it has many times chosen poorly and made mistakes and done terrible things in doing that. And having that kind of license to operate as it wishes, it has very often acted in illiberal ways and acted in self-interested ways. I think that part of the dynamic is probably inherent in any leading power. Britain thought of itself as the great liberal power while maintaining an incredibly rapacious empire at the same time. So that piece of it maybe is at least more understandable. And I always think to myself, the way to think about that issue is the United States has been a terrible global hegemon, except when you think about all the others, right? I mean, if the Soviet Union had won the Cold War, what would the world look like? If Hitler had won World War II, what would it look like? If Imperial Germany had won World War I, what would the world look like? So among the available alternatives, the United States has done pretty darn well. And maybe I say this as an immigrant, but I do think it's really true. The history backs it up. The second piece, I think, is, America is this very strange country. It is amazingly dynamic and innovative and can generate ideas and innovations and wealth on a scale that is difficult to understand and always able to renew itself. So in 2008, the United States and Western Europe and Europe all went into this horrible global financial crisis. US and Eurozone economies were the same size in 2008. Today, the United States economy is twice the size of the Eurozone economy. If Britain were to join the United States as the 51st state, it would be the poorest state in the Union. It would be below Mississippi in per capita income. That's how well we have managed to thrive. But we are a ragged, unequal nation, and we tolerate enormous discrepancies within our system. And I think we kid ourselves that you need that for the dynamism, but we can be incredibly cruel in the way we treat the poorest people in America. I think that's the real tragedy of the American system. We actually, we talk so much about the middle class and the working class. The United States does a lot. And if you look at, there are various ways of calculating the welfare state. The United States has a very large welfare state when you think about tax credits and all that kind of stuff. But very little of it is spent on the very poor. The very poor have terrible nutrition, terrible daycare, terrible education, because it's funded through property taxes. We are unique in the modern world in funding education through property taxes, which means poor communities get bad schools, rich communities get good schools. All of that seems to me unnecessary. It would actually help the country to have these people, these groups more integrated, more included. There's talent, sprinkled randomly throughout America, and I think we miss a lot of the incredible talent that's out there. And if there was one flaw in the American system, I would try to fix it's that. And it's the reason is we have this brutally competitive political system where they don't contribute much money to candidates, they don't vote that much, they don't write op-eds, they don't form PACs, and as a result, they are almost invisible in the American political landscape.
Indeed. I'm going to turn now in our last 10 minutes to some questions that were contributed from the audience. I'll begin with one from Greg B. from Arlington, Mass. How will the age of revolutions impact our response to the climate and biodiversity crises? And if that isn't, once you've answered that, the second part is, and what is the end game on these issues? I sometimes think about climate change as sort of like above my pay grade, because if it's really going to happen at the scale that people think, we're all screwed. And I don't know what more to say, because in a sense, but the way I would think about it is the challenge we face is we're clearly entering part of the backlash that I'm describing in this book is a return of nationalism and a turning away from global cooperation, even on something as simple as trade, which is a kind of win-win, actually.
If China gets richer, it actually makes America richer in the aggregate. But that is not how we're seeing things. We're seeing things much more narrow, nationalistic, chauvinistic terms. And that is a great danger when you think that the principal challenge we face is to find some way to cooperate on climate issues, because those affect us all. And one person's bad behavior affects everybody, and one person's good behavior affects everybody. And so finding a way to almost isolate that and say, can we just agree that we face this common danger and we want to, to act together on it? And to be fair, a lot of countries are trying to do that. But I think that there should be a much greater emphasis on that rather than saying, we're just going to do what we can do. There is a sort of, even in our climate policy now, there is an enormous amount of nationalism. We're saying we want to solve the climate crisis, but, by the way, we're going to put tariffs on European and Chinese goods. We're going to subsidize American goods. If solar panels are made in China, they're bad. If they're made in America, they're good. And I understand the impulse, but you're kind of working at cross purposes then. Either this is a climate crisis that we have to all collectively tackle, or all we're trying to do is to screw the other countries and get there first in an economic race, which is actually not going to be one that will benefit climate change, will help us ameliorate climate change.
Yeah, no, I'll throw out an idea, not a prediction, but an idea that because climate change is the ultimate collective action problem, as you note, American politicians can say truthfully, why should we cut back on our emissions at some hit to our economy if China and Indonesia and India are just going to be burning more and more coal, and our sacrifice will make no difference? And of course, every country can think that. And then, of course, China and India can say, why should we cut back on our economic growth now that Europe and the United States have gotten rich by burning lots of carbon?
You're absolutely right, Stephen, and it triggers a thought. One of the tragedies of the kind of declinism or the decline mentality that Trump has so infused in the American political rhetoric, which is completely wrong. The United States, as I point out, is double the size of Europe. We've done very well. We have distributional problems, and we should be helping people who get displaced much more than we are. But in aggregate, we are doing much better than any large economy in the world. But when you start thinking in those terms of we're declining, we're going down, you become very nationalistic. And if you think about, America in the 50s and 60s, for all our problems, there was a kind of confidence in America that said, for example, we're going to open the world up to trade. Other countries will grow faster than we will. That's the nature of opening yourself up to trade. We will open our markets up unilaterally to Western Europe, to Japan, and those countries will grow at 7% while we're growing at 4%. And that's fine, because the reality is all our economies will get bigger, all our people will get richer. That's not the mentality we have approached climate change with.
Yeah, I'll throw out one idea, which is a way we may not be cooked despite this wicked collective action problem, and that is if technological innovation could make clean energy cheaper than dirty energy, everyone would opt for clean energy in their self-interest, and the problem wouldn't require this elusive global cooperation.
What we need is an energy source that is zero emissions, that is cheaper than coal. If you cannot come up with something that is cheaper than coal, it doesn't address, because what you want is that the Chinese adopt it for their self-interest, which is that it's cheaper than the most readily available energy to them, and the Indians adopt it for the same reason. Then you've solved the problem.
I completely agree. Let me end up with one question that I think may sound impossible, but I think that you're perfectly equipped to answer it. So from Allison W. in Belmont, Mass., you report beautifully on so many of our world's challenges, and you have a rare vantage point into the complexity of our world. What gives you hope as someone who deeply understands both the tragic and the beautiful in our world? Perfect question for Fareed Zakaria.
Well, look, at some level, I'm an immigrant, so I have to be optimistic. I've sort of made my choice. I'll tell you a funny story. I'm sure he will deny it, but there was a time when Fox News was not as crazy as it is now. And for one of my books called The Post-American World, Sean Hannity had me on for his book. He had a book program or a weekend show. So anyway, I go and tape the show with him. And I don't think he had read the book, but he had read the title. And so he kept saying, post-American world. I don't know, Fareed, this just sounds like, do you love America? And after the third time he says this, I said to him, you know, Sean, I'm an immigrant. I chose to become an American. I moved here, chose this country, left behind my country, my culture, parts of my family. You're an accidental American. You did nothing other than being born here. He edited that out in the... So I think that at some level, you know, and I also think I'm a Pinkarian in that I do think things do over time get better, and you just have to recognize that it's always complicated. There are always trade-offs. There's stuff that goes well and things that go badly, and you try to ameliorate one with the other. But I think there's no doubt that we're in an age of backlash. You know, we've had 7 straight years of declining democracy around the world, and the quality and quantity of democracy declining. We're closing down on trade. We're closing down on information flows. You look at the quality of American democracy, and you worry about it when you think about this election coming up. You know, I know people always say that these are big consequential elections. Well, you know, this is an election in which you have one of the people running is the first president in American history who tried to stop the peaceful transfer of power. That is not a normal thing. That has only happened once in American history. So, you know, there is real stuff that one has to worry about. And I do think, you know, the future doesn't get better if you fatalistically assume it will. You have to fight for it. You have to work hard at it. You have to support the things you believe in. You have to get out there. And it's, you know, social media gives you this illusion that you are being virtuous by clicking a button, by pressing like. This is why, you know, when the Arab Spring happened, everyone is so surprised that Facebook didn't allow the Arab world to get transformed. You know, every Arab country that had the Arab Spring is now back to being a dictatorship. Well, guess what? Because saying like on Facebook doesn't make you change the government, doesn't instill civil society, liberal democracy. It takes much more than that. But I do think what gives me hope is, at the end of the day, human beings do want to be free. Think about what I was saying about Ukraine. Think about, you know, people. I watched a documentary about families in North Korea escaping to go to South Korea, and the crazy challenges that they face and the odds that they face, and how desperately they try to do it. You know, when you think about those kinds of people who recognize what the value of freedom is, what the value of this liberal enlightenment project is that started in the West and has spread to so many parts of the world, I think it is very inspiring, and it is something we should be very much prouder of than we are. Bono, the singer, says that there should be, you know, many more songs written and flags flown for the European Union, because the European Union is not a bureaucracy, it's an idea. And the idea is that these countries that went to war for 500, 600 years have now found a way to live in peace and live in harmony and think of themselves as part of one larger project. These are incredibly inspiring ideas. And I don't think the battle is lost on that front. I think that at the end of the day, you know, the free world, if you want to put it that way, it's probably 60-70% of global GDP. It's probably 75-80% of global military spending. So it has both the capacity to defend itself, it has the vitality to stay rich. What I sometimes wonder is why we have lost the confidence that came from it. You know, that sense of, I think we sometimes spend so much time thinking about all the imperfections in our society that we lose sight of the fact that this is a great achievement. We should feel incredible pride in it. We should try to, you know, make it even better. But in the grand sweep of history, this is one of the great one of the great disruptions, one of the great revolutions that has taken place, a revolution that liberated the human spirit, the individuals. And as long as we can fight for it, I think in the long run we will win.
Fareed, you make nuance and balance and moderation and erudition and sophistication inspiring. And on behalf of the entire audience, I thank you for a fantastic, considered book and performance tonight. Thank you, Fareed.